I stopped arguing on the internet in 2008, and I know when it was because I looked up the last argumentative thing I said, and it was 4 years ago. And when you stop taking part in any arguments, you start to read other people's arguments differently, because you're not composing your response in your head, you're literally just listening to what they're saying. It sounds facetious, but that turns out to be like a genuine difference in the way you process information. When it's kind of out of your area, like it's something you don't have to respond to, it's not relevant to you, it's not going to be part of a fight that you're going to be in. And so you can absorb it in a much more relaxed way. When you start to pay attention to the way people argue, one of the things you notice, if you haven't noticed it already, is that people don't really get anywhere in internet arguments. It kind of just gets more and more vicious without ever resolving the issue. And it becomes incredibly, painfully easy to see where that happens. You don't necessarily have to stop arguing for this to happen. Probably a lot of people have had this realization without having to go to that step first, but any forum thread, you can pinpoint the exact moment at which person A says something to person A says something that's like an argument that's got a slight flaw in it, and person B notices this flaw and wants to point it out, which is so far great. This is what we should be doing. And they point it out, and then they just can't resist like a little line at the end of snark, just a little dig to make the other person not only see the error, but also feel stupid about it. And that, rather than highlighting the error to the first person or emphasizing the extent of the error, causes them to shut down and completely ignore the actual problem with their argument and start retaliating, and start defending their position, because they've been attacked now, like someone's been insulting to them, so they've got to defend their position and save face. And I think that, in some cases it's just people being careless with words and just not realizing that they're going to start a fight, and not having had this realization about how easily these things go off course. But in other cases it's very intentional, and it's because everybody on every side of every heated argument believes that they are right and that this is important. And because they're right and because it's important, it's okay to fight, it's okay to be angry, it's okay to attack the other person. And for the same reason, I'm not going to actually talk about any particular issues in reference to this. I'm not going to tell you any particular arguments I'm thinking of, or or what side I come down on any of them. Because, as I say, it changes the way you process information when you agree with someone or when you don't agree with someone, or even if you just think you're going to have to respond to this thing. But I'll give you an example with the issue removed. I read a comment on an article where the commenter has a radically different opinion to me on a controversial issue, and goes through it in some depth. It does explain his reasoning, although it's crazy reasoning. And the people responding to it, the people who agree with me on this issue, their responses to his fairly lengthy post were cunt, douchebag, and kill yourself. When did my side become those guys? When did all sides become those guys? I don't like those guys. Or at least I don't want to become those guys, because it doesn't really get you anywhere. So I got interested in why we disagree about things. How does it actually come about that two people can have viewpoints that are so different they just attack each other on sight? They just, as soon as you see the other viewpoint, explode, just start telling people to die. And I already knew some of the reasons because I did philosophy, and you discover fairly quickly in philosophy that most of the major debates in trying to understand the world around us in a non-scientific way, i.e. dealing with all the things that are too crazy and weird for science currently, most of it has been a giant waste of time, because people had just not defined the words in the debate very clearly, and so they've been arguing for thousands of years about whether reality is mental or physical, and really, if you've been rigorous about your definition of reality, then reality is just this stuff, and whether it's real, whether it's like physical or mental, is not actually a meaningful distinction, because we're just calling it that. That wasn't the best example I've ever come up with for this, but it's scary and embarrassing how many really angry debates boil down to just, oh, well, I define this word this way, and you're defining it that way. So if one of us or both of us just came up with a new word for what we mean, then we don't have to argue anymore. There's no actual disagreement. We don't have different opinions about how the world should be. We're just using words differently. And then beyond that, the other way that these things get really vicious and opinions diverge wildly is just through people's experience, right? Like, I don't think people are kind of born just wired completely differently. I don't think they're like people born evil and born good. Obviously, there are extreme cases where, you know, there can be proper physical mental deficiencies. Physical mental is my strange new phrase for where there is something measurably wrong with the brain, or measurably unusual about the brain, that causes it to process information in a different way, and given the same set of experiences would have a radically different and, by society standards, crazy response to that. Those are obviously different cases, but I think in most cases the major source of disagreement is a difference in experience. You know, people who've grown up with friends or relatives who belong to a certain group will probably not be a massive jerk towards that group. It's really hard to generalize about these things without actually making it sound like a specific issue, but you know what I mean. When you're exposed to when you see something firsthand, it can change your opinion on it dramatically. And when something affects you directly, or someone very close to you directly, you have a very different opinion on it to if it's just a theory and it's just, you know, oh, the government's saying X should do Y to this group of people. And all our experiences affect us on a really profound level, and also a really subtle level. Like, in some cases, the examples I just gave are ones where you can, if you do any self-reflection at all, you can spot, oh, I'm probably influenced by that happening in my life. But I think there are much more cases where we don't know what's influencing us at all. And I read about a study where a group of people were shown a list of statements and not told whether any of them were true or false. They're just statements about, like, politics, statements like me saying, hey, there was a study where it was proved that this. Those kinds of completely unbacked up things where there's no particular reason to believe them, they're just written down on a piece of paper. And then a month later, they are shown another list of statements which has some of the same ones on it and some that are completely different, and asked to say whether they're true or false. And the bias towards ones they'd seen before being marked as true was statistically significant. In other words, just having seen something written down without even the person showing it to you telling you that it's true, nobody saying it's true, they're just seeing a statement written down, like, significantly influences you to believe it in future. You'll just see it and you'll just think it's true. And in each case, when they were asked to justify why they believed it, nobody said, oh, because I saw it written down, because that's a crazy reason. No one would actually believe it because of that. They all had their own reasons. They just backed it up with, you know, whatever they did have in their experience that related to that. There's just this kind of silent consensus going on where things you see and experience just get fed straight into your brain without you knowing it's happening. And that was for statements written on a piece of paper. Imagine how much, like, the actual emotional impact of people you know and major life events. Imagine how far-reaching and deep that is without us being able to rationalise about it. Which is all, like, none of that's, you know, oh, the human brain's crap and we should abandon it and stop having experiences. That would be a radical position and a hard one to persuade you of. But when you start looking at it that way, it becomes a weird thing to hate someone else for, doesn't it? Like, you've had different experiences to me. Fuck you! I hope you get raped! That's the thing people actually say in arguments now. I mean, crazy people, but the same ones are saying cunt, douchebag, and kill yourself, so they can't really talk. So, it doesn't really make any sense to fight over that. Like, argument in theory should be a sort of debate where you throw around logic and point out fallacies in other people's arguments, which is hard to say with a straight face. But it never works out that way because of the snark factor, because everyone has to get in their little digs at each other, and then they have to get defensive, and then defensiveness leads to more defensiveness, and it just becomes a fight. And we shouldn't fight, we should be... There's a scary number of people fighting right now. There's... verbally, I mean. A scary number of nice people. It seems like on lots of major issues, there are people I like on both sides, and people I, think of as being rational and sane and smart and kind and polite. But in these particular arguments, they're just fucking destroying each other, just laying into each other in really vicious, horrible ways. And if the source of those disagreements is just we've had different experiences, it seems like we might have lost sight of how that came about completely. Like, if you encounter somebody who has a radically different opinion to you, you should be trying to understand that. You should be just trying to figure out how that came about. Isn't that interesting? Like, aren't you curious how that could have happened? Isn't there, like, something to be learned there? And I feel like the attitude we should have towards major disagreements is, rather than suddenly spontaneously attacking each other, it should be like, we should be comparing notes. Trying to conduct this massive lifelong experiment on the world to find out how it works and how it should be, and all of us have this incredibly imperfect data set. We've all got this really scant collection of random experiences that we happen to have bumped into, and then we find other people who've had different experiences and we just attack them for that. I mean, it's just completely absurd when you put it in those terms. If you're actually seeing it as an experiment, and you're seeing it as a thing you're trying to learn and study, and you're always trying to get better at understanding the world and trying to make better decisions and more informed decisions, then someone with a different opinion is a valuable source of other data. Like, we've both got two different data sets. We should be comparing notes and figuring out how those two match up and how we come to our own conclusions, and understanding the other person's perspective and trying to absorb that. I think any time you can understand someone else's perspective, you come out smarter and you come out righter than you were before. And you probably, even if you don't, you're probably not going to switch to their opinion. And you might not even change yours, but if you know what the other opinion is and how it comes about, then you're much, much better at dealing with it and better at understanding the world and other people. And so the process of arguing, I think, should be the process of just sharing your perspective in the clearest way you can, without any hostility whatsoever. Just explain what you believe and how you came to believe it without ever insulting the opposing view. Even if the opposing view is Hitler, don't even remotely insult it. Just explain your perspective and how you came to it. Because when you add the little line of snark to the end of that forum post, or you just add that little bit of invective, or you let your hatred seep into what you've written, it doesn't make your argument stronger, it just ends the argument and starts a fight. And from that point forward, nothing is going to happen. Like, you've sacrificed your only chance of actually changing someone's mind for a chance to win the argument. And you're never going to win the argument, because arguments don't get won. And the good news is, if you disagree with all of this completely, I'm not going to argue.